The British Empire is remembered for its navy, its railroads, its legal systems, and its missionaries. Textbooks give you Waterloo, the Industrial Revolution, and the spread of the English language across 6 continents. That is the official story. That is the first lie. The real architecture of British imperial power was not built on coal or cotton or military genius. It was built on addiction, engineered, deliberate, state-sanctioned addiction. And the proof is not buried in some speculative archive. It sits in the parliamentary records of the British government itself, printed in 1832, in 1840, and again in 1894. For anyone with the patience to read what they actually said about what they were actually doing, here is the number that changes everything. Between 1773 and 1947, Britain's opium monopoly in India generated revenues conservatively estimated at over $400 million. Adjusted for today's purchasing power, that figure crosses 50 billion. This was not smuggling. This was not a black market operation run by criminal networks hiding from government scrutiny. This was government policy, audited, debated in Parliament, defended by prime ministers, and allocated line by line to fund naval expansion, industrial infrastructure, and the financial machinery that made Britain the dominant economic force on the planet for 150 years. You are not looking at a historical footnote. You are looking at the financial engine of the British Empire. And once you see how it was engineered, you will recognize its blueprint in systems that are operating right now, today, in your world. Welcome to Histonic's Drift, where we pull back the curtain on history's real players and the systems they built to stay in control. To understand what Britain built, you need to understand what existed before Britain arrived. Opium was not a British invention. The poppy plant had been cultivated across South Asia and the Middle East for centuries. Arab traders moved it along established routes. Indian physicians used it in medicinal preparations. Chinese merchants imported small quantities. The trade existed, but it existed as a distributed multiplayer market with no single controlling entity. That is the key distinction. Distribution without concentration is commerce. Distribution with total concentration is extraction. Warren Hastings changed that in 1773. Hastings was the first Governor-General of British India, appointed to bring order to the chaotic expansion of the East India Company across the subcontinent. He faced an immediate structural problem. The company had conquered enormous territory. It now had to administer, garrison, and profit from that territory simultaneously. Tax revenues from agriculture were inconsistent. Trade in textiles and spices required competing with established Dutch and Portuguese networks. The company needed a revenue stream that was reliable, scalable, and defensible to London shareholders. Hastings chose opium, not because the opportunity fell into his lap, but because he understood what the commodity economics of addiction meant for a monopoly holder. He restructured the entire opium production system in Bengal, the region Britain now controlled. Under the new architecture, every farmer who grew the opium poppy was required to sell his entire harvest exclusively to the East India Company at a fixed, government-set price. The company then processed the raw opium into standardized chests, moved it to Calcutta, and auctioned those chests to licensed private merchants who carried it onward to China. The cost to produce one chest of opium in Bengal was approximately 2 rupees. The auction price in Calcutta reached 1,200 rupees and above by the peak years of the trade. That is a 600 to 1 profit margin, not 60%, not 600%. 600 times the production cost, captured at the point of monopoly control, before the product even left Indian soil. This was not market pricing. Markets require competition to set prices. This was extraction pricing, made possible by total structural control over every pressure point in the supply chain. The farmers had no alternative buyer. The processing facilities were company property. The auction system was company administered. The licensing of merchants was company controlled. Britain had not entered a market. It had engineered a bottleneck and positioned itself as the sole gatekeeper. The mechanics matter because they reveal the intention. Hastings and the company directors in London did not stumble onto opium revenues. They designed a system with the explicit goal of concentrating maximum value at the point of company control, while distributing the social costs of addiction entirely onto populations Britain had already conquered or intended to conquer. The Indian farmers bore the risk of crop failure at fixed prices. The Chinese population bore the consequences of mass addiction. Britain collected the margin. By 1790, opium revenues had become a structural component of the company's balance sheet. By 1800, no serious financial planning for British India proceeded without opium revenue projections built into the core budget assumptions. The addiction of the commodity itself, meaning its guaranteed repeat demand from users who had crossed into physical dependence, made it the most predictable revenue line the company possessed. Cotton prices fluctuated with weather and competition. Opium demand from established users was, in the company's own internal assessments, essentially inelastic. They knew what they were building. The records prove they knew. William Jardine was a Scottish physician who arrived in Asia as a ship's surgeon for the East India Company in 1802. He was methodical, cold-blooded in his commercial reasoning, and possessed of a specific talent for identifying where structural leverage existed in a market and then applying maximum pressure to it. By the 1820s, he had left medicine and entered the opium trade as a private merchant operating under company license. By the 1830s, he was the dominant private operator in the China opium trade, running the firm that became Jardine Matheson, a company that still exists today and still operates across Asia. His private correspondence from the 1830s, held in the archives of Cambridge University Library, is among the most revealing documentary evidence of how the opium system actually functioned at the intersection of private profit and state power. In a letter dated 1830, Jardine wrote to a business associate describing the China trade with the kind of clarity that internal correspondence always provides when the author believes no public scrutiny will follow. He described opium not as a commodity, but as a mechanism. His language centered on flow and volume. He was not interested in what opium did to the people who consumed it. He was interested in what the silver those people spent on opium did to the trade balance between China and Britain. His framing was entirely hydraulic. Money flowed in one direction. His job was to maximize the rate of that flow. The critical element of Jardine's correspondence is not just what he wrote, but who he wrote to. His letters went not only to business partners, but directly to British government officials, including Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston, and those officials wrote back. The correspondence documents a working relationship between the largest private opium merchant operating in Asia and the senior members of the British government, including direct communication about how to respond when the Chinese government attempted to restrict the trade. When Commissioner Lin Zexu was appointed by the Qing Emperor in 1839 to suppress the opium trade in Canton, he was confronting a system that operated at three simultaneous levels. At the bottom level were the farmers in Bengal, who had no choice but to grow poppies for the company. At the middle level were merchants like Jardine, who moved the product from India to China using fast ships specifically designed for the trade. At the top level was the British state, which provided diplomatic cover, military protection when needed, and the political architecture that kept the monopoly legally unassailable in India. Lin Zexu understood the system clearly. His memorial to the Qing Emperor in 1839 is a document of extraordinary precision for its time. He estimated that China had accumulated approximately 2 million opium addicts by that date. He calculated that the silver drain required to pay for the opium imports had removed approximately 100 million taels of silver from the Chinese economy. To put that figure in context, it represented roughly 1/3 of the entire Chinese money supply. Britain was not simply selling a product to China. It was draining the monetary base of the largest economy in Asia. Systematically and at scale, Lin confiscated and destroyed 20,000 chests of British-owned opium at Canton, worth approximately $2 million at auction prices. Jardine was in London when he heard the news. His response was not to accept the loss as a consequence of illegal trade. His response was to lobby the British government directly to use military force to recover compensation and reopen the trade. He met with Palmerston. He provided detailed operational intelligence about Chinese coastal defenses, harbor geography, and the military assets required to force a settlement. The first opium war that followed was not a spontaneous governmental decision. It was a war designed in significant part by a private merchant protecting his revenue stream, executed by a state that treated those revenues as structurally essential to the imperial budget. The Jardine correspondence makes one thing impossible to argue away. This was not a system that grew without awareness of its consequences. The people who designed it, administered it, and defended it with military force understood precisely what they were doing, and chose to do it because the financial returns justified the human cost in their explicit calculations. The most powerful evidence against the British government's legacy defense that the opium system was simply a product of its era is the evidence the British government itself produced in Parliament. The Parliamentary Papers of 1832, 1840, and 1894 are not interpretations by later historians. They are the transcripts of official testimony, the financial reports submitted to government committees, and the policy debates conducted by elected representatives who were directly aware of what the opium revenues funded and how they were generated. The 1832 parliamentary inquiry into the affairs of the East India Company produced testimony that established, in official record, that opium revenues comprised between 15 and 20% of the total revenue of British India. This was not a marginal income stream from a peripheral activity. It was a foundational budget line, comparable in scale to land tax revenues, and exceeding the revenues generated by any single manufactured export from the subcontinent. The committee members who heard this testimony did not react with alarm. They treated the figure as a point of administrative pride, evidence that the company was managing its Indian territories with financial sophistication. The 1840 papers, produced in the direct aftermath of the First Opium War, went further. They contained detailed accounting of how opium revenues had been allocated in the preceding decades. Military expenditure in India, including the garrison costs of maintaining British control over the subcontinent, was partially funded through opium receipts. Naval deployments in Asian waters, the infrastructure of force projection that made British trade dominance possible across the Indian Ocean, drew on the same revenue pool. The papers did not hide this. They presented it as rational colonial financial management, which is precisely what it was from the British government's perspective. The 1894 papers are the most extensive and in some respects the most revealing, because by 1894 there was an active reform movement in Britain arguing that the opium trade was morally indefensible. The Royal Commission on Opium, which produced the 1894 report, was established in part to answer those critics. The Commission's majority report, written by officials with direct financial interests in the continuation of the trade, concluded that opium use in India was largely moderate and that the revenues were essential to Indian governance. The minority dissent, written by reform-aligned commissioners, documented addiction rates and mortality figures that directly contradicted the majority's conclusions. What makes the 1894 papers significant beyond their content is their structural function. By 1894, Britain had been operating the opium monopoly for 121 years. The system had become so deeply embedded in the financial architecture of British India that the Commission did not seriously consider ending it. Their task, as defined by the government that commissioned them, was to defend its continuation. The parliamentary record at this point becomes a document not of inquiry, but of institutionalized protection for a revenue stream that had long since graduated from policy choice to structural dependency. The numbers the papers reveal, taken together across the period from 1773 to 1947, tell a specific financial story. Opium revenues funded a meaningful share of the military costs that kept Britain in control of India. They contributed to the infrastructure investment, including railroads, telegraph systems, and port facilities, that made India economically productive for British extraction. They provided a reliable, high-margin income stream that stabilized the finances of British India during periods when other revenues were under pressure. And they generated the surplus capital flows that moved from India to Britain, contributing to the accumulation that funded industrial investment at home. The $50 billion figure in today's terms is a conservative estimate. It does not capture the downstream value of the infrastructure those revenues funded, or the compounded economic advantage Britain gained from maintaining naval supremacy in Asian waters across a century and a half. The direct revenue figure is the floor, not the ceiling, of what the opium system contributed to British imperial power. To fully grasp what the opium monopoly accomplished for Britain, you need to understand what it simultaneously did to China, because the two outcomes were not separate. They were the same mechanism operating from opposite ends. In 1800, China was the largest economy in the world by GDP. Its share of global economic output was approximately 33%, compared to Britain's 4%. This was not a primitive agricultural society. The Qing Empire administered a complex commercial economy with sophisticated financial instruments, extensive internal trade networks, and a manufacturing sector in silk, porcelain, and textiles that supplied global markets. China ran consistent trade surpluses with virtually every trading partner it engaged with, including Britain. That surplus was the problem Britain needed to solve. When British merchants wanted Chinese goods, they had to pay in silver. China did not want British manufactured goods in significant quantities. British woolens found no market in a subtropical climate. British ceramics could not compete with Chinese porcelain. The trade relationship was structurally unfavorable to Britain because China held the leverage of superior products and domestic self-sufficiency. Britain had to export silver to sustain the trade, which created a persistent drain on British monetary reserves and a corresponding accumulation of silver in China. Opium reversed this entirely. Once the East India Company established the scale production system in Bengal and began flooding Chinese markets with cheap, high-quality opium through Jardine and his fellow merchants, the silver flow changed direction. Chinese consumers paid silver for opium. That silver moved to the merchants who sold it. The merchants used it to buy Chinese goods. But the critical point is that the opium itself was produced in British-controlled India at 2 rupees per chest and sold in China at prices generating 600-to-1 margins. The silver that China spent on opium was silver that had previously been accumulating as a natural consequence of China's trade surpluses. Britain was not just selling a product, it was recovering at enormous margin the silver that centuries of legitimate trade had moved into Chinese hands. Lin Zexu's calculation of 100 million taels drained by the early 1830s captures only the volume visible to Qing government records. The actual silver drain across the full period of the trade was substantially larger, and the consequences for China went beyond simple monetary loss. China's monetary system in this period was bimetallic, with copper coins used for small domestic transactions and silver used for tax payments and large commercial settlements. As silver drained out of the economy, its exchange rate against copper rose. A farmer who owed taxes in silver but earned income in copper found that his effective tax burden increased as the silver-to-copper ratio deteriorated. Agricultural communities across China faced rising effective taxation, not because the government raised rates, but because the monetary base was being systematically depleted by the opium trade. Social pressure built. Government revenues fell as silver became scarcer. The fiscal capacity of the Qing state to respond to internal challenges weakened precisely as those challenges intensified. The Opium Wars were not simply about Britain forcing China to accept a trade it found morally objectionable. They were about Britain using military force to prevent China from protecting its monetary system from deliberate British extraction. Lin Zexu destroyed the opium at Canton precisely because he understood that the drug itself was the vector through which China's silver, and therefore its financial sovereignty, was being systematically removed. Britain went to war to reopen that extraction mechanism. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842, which ended the First Opium War, did not mention opium by name. Instead, it opened 5 treaty ports to British trade, ceded Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity, and required China to pay a war indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, a portion of which was specifically designated to compensate British merchants for the opium Lin Zexu had confiscated and destroyed. China paid Britain for the opium its government had destroyed while trying to protect its own population. The silver drain continued. The extraction machinery was back in operation, now protected by treaty rights enforced by the Royal Navy. By 1850, 8 years after the Treaty of Nanking, China was an internal revolt. The Taiping Rebellion, which killed between 20 and 30 million people and became the deadliest civil conflict in recorded history to that point, drew its fuel from the economic conditions that a decade of escalating silver drain had created. The connection between the opium trade and the Taiping collapse is not speculative. The monetary distortion that Lin Zexu documented in 1839 deepened through the 1840s as the trade expanded following British military victory. The social fractures that produced the rebellion were the direct downstream consequence of financial extraction that had been running for 70 years. The $50 billion generated by the opium monopoly did not sit idle in British government accounts. It moved, and where it moved explains much of what Britain built in the 19th century. The most immediate allocation was military. Maintaining British control over India required a permanent garrison of British troops, supplemented by far larger Indian sepoy forces, all requiring pay, weapons training, and logistical support. The costs were enormous and constant. The opium revenues provided a reliable funding stream that allowed the India budget to sustain military expenditure without constant emergency transfers from the British Treasury in London. Parliamentary records from the 1840s and 1850s show opium revenues cited specifically in debates about military capacity, with members arguing against any disruption to the trade on the grounds that the garrison could not be funded without it. The second major allocation was naval. The Royal Navy's dominance in Asian waters was not free. Maintaining squadrons in the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, and across the Pacific required ships, crews, provisions, and the network of coaling stations and harbor facilities that made extended operations possible. Hong Kong, acquired in 1842, was the most visible piece of this infrastructure. Its value as a trading post was secondary to its value as a deepwater harbor that allowed the Royal Navy to project force across the Western Pacific. It was, in effect, the naval base that Opium War profits built. The third allocation, and the one with the longest economic tail, was Indian infrastructure. The railroad network that Britain constructed across India between 1850 and 1900 is often cited as evidence of British benevolence, a gift of modern transportation to a previously fragmented subcontinent. The railroad network was infrastructure for extraction. It moved raw materials from interior production regions to coastal ports for shipment to Britain. It moved British manufactured goods from ports to interior markets to undercut Indian domestic manufacturing, and its construction was financed in part through the opium revenues that provided the stable budget, surplus from which capital investment could be drawn. The same analysis applies to the telegraph network, the port modernization projects at Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras, and the administrative infrastructure of the Indian civil service. These were not charity, they were the fixed capital investments of a sophisticated extraction operation, and the opium monopoly was the revenue engine that made them financially feasible at the scale Britain deployed them. Beyond India, the capital flows generated by the opium trade had effects in Britain itself. The merchants who profited from the trade, Jardine, Matheson, and their network of associates, reinvested their Asian profits into British industrial ventures. Jardine Matheson capital moved into British railroads, banking houses, and manufacturing enterprises in the 1840s and 1850s, the precise period when British industrial infrastructure was making the investments that would define its economic dominance for the following century. The opium profits were not sequestered in Asia. They flowed back through merchant networks into the British domestic economy providing capital at a moment when capital was the binding constraint on industrial expansion. The gold standard connection is the most structurally significant and least discussed element of the story. Britain's adoption of the gold standard in 1821 and its maintenance through the 19th century required a consistent ability to defend the pound's convertibility, which in turn required maintaining adequate gold and silver reserves and running the international financial accounts in a way that preserved British monetary credibility. The opium trade contributed to this by generating consistent silver flows from China into British-controlled accounts. The silver that drained from China to pay for opium moved through the financial systems of British India and British merchant houses, contributing to the reserve base that underpinned sterling's credibility as the world's dominant reserve currency throughout the 19th century. When economists and historians describe the 19th century as the era of British financial supremacy, they are describing a structure that rested, in part, on revenues generated by a state-administered narcotics monopoly. The gold standard, the pound sterling, and British financial dominance were not purely the products of industrial efficiency or superior financial innovation. They were built on a foundation that included, as a documented and significant component, the addiction of millions of people to a substance that Britain produced, distributed, and sold at 600 to 1 profit margins. In 1995, Purdue Pharma launched OxyContin. The marketing strategy that followed was not accidental. Sales representatives were trained to tell physicians that the drug's extended-release formula made addiction unlikely, a claim the company's own internal research did not support. They targeted high-prescribing physicians in regions with high rates of manual labor injury, places where people worked with their bodies, and where chronic pain was a genuine and widespread condition. They built distribution networks that moved product efficiently from manufacturer to end consumer through the legitimizing infrastructure of the medical system. The parallels to the British opium system are not general, they are structural. The East India Company used the legitimizing infrastructure of trade and empire to distribute a product it knew created addiction. It targeted populations that were already stressed by poverty or social disruption because those populations were the most reliable consumers. It used regulatory capture, controlling the governmental bodies that might have restricted the trade to prevent interference. It characterized addiction as a cultural choice or a personal failing rather than a predictable physiological response to the product it was selling. And it used the revenues generated by addiction to fund the political and military infrastructure that protected its ability to continue selling. Purdue used the legitimizing infrastructure of medicine. It targeted populations stressed by physical pain and economic anxiety. It captured regulatory relationships through lobbying and consulting arrangements with officials who moved between industry and government. It characterized addiction to OxyContin as a failure of patient willpower rather than a predictable response to a powerfully addictive substance. And it used its revenues to fund the legal and political infrastructure that delayed regulatory response for 2 decades. The mechanism is identical. The product and the century are different. The structural logic is the same. The pattern extends beyond pharmaceuticals. The Golden Triangle, encompassing Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand, produces opium and heroin that funds insurgent and state-adjacent military forces across Southeast Asia. The revenues from narcotics have funded Myanmar's military operations against civilian populations, armed factions in the Shan state, and intelligence operations that Western governments track but do not effectively suppress, in part because the geopolitical complexity of the region makes disrupting the drug economy strategically inconvenient. Afghanistan under the Taliban became, within 2 years of the 2021 withdrawal, the source of 80% of global heroin supply, generating revenues estimated at $1 billion to $3 billion annually that fund governance and military capacity in a state with almost no other functional revenue base. Mexico's cartel economy generates estimated annual revenues between $19 billion and $29 billion, a financial system larger than many legitimate national economies, funding not just criminal organizations, but the political capture of state institutions at federal, state, and municipal levels. The cartels are not parasites on the Mexican state. In significant regions, they are the de facto state, providing the enforcement, the infrastructure investment, and the revenue redistribution that government institutions cannot or will not provide. These are not isolated criminal phenomena. They are the contemporary expression of the same structural insight that Warren Hastings applied in Bengal in 1773. Addictive substances create inelastic demand. Inelastic demand, concentrated in the hands of a monopoly or near monopoly supplier, generates extraction-level profits. Those profits fund the political, military, and administrative infrastructure that protects the monopoly. The monopoly holder captures the margin. The social costs are distributed onto the population of consumers and the communities around them. Britain institutionalized this as state policy and ran it for 174 years. It funded an empire with it. And when the empire ended, the blueprint did not disappear. It moved into new hands, new geographies, and new industries, with the same structural logic operating beneath surfaces that look entirely different from the outside. The money you spend on prescription medication flows through a distribution system built on lobbying, regulatory capture, and the deliberate management of physician prescribing behavior. The taxes your government collects fund military and intelligence operations in regions where the narcotics economy is intertwined with the geopolitical interests your government is pursuing. The financial system your mortgage and pension sit inside was built, in part, on capital flows, generated by 19th century narcotics revenues moving through merchant banking networks into industrial investment. History does not repeat because the same things keep happening by accident. It repeats because the same structural incentives, concentrated control over addictive demand streams, keep producing the same structural outcomes when actors with the capacity to build monopolies encounter them. Britain did not build its empire on coal and cotton and courage. It built a significant and documented portion of it on the deliberate addiction of millions of people, administered through parliamentary-approved policy, defended with naval force, and accounted for in budget documents that the British government produced and filed and hoped you would never read. You just read them. Histonics drift. We pull back the curtain on history's real players and the systems they built to stay in control.